Good evening and a very warm welcome to all our viewers. My name is Samantha Castle and I'm the Senior Manager for Alumni Relations at the University of Pretoria. As promised, the Lead UP Alumni Thought Leadership Series is committed to bringing together a panel of experts, including UP alumni, to discuss and suggest solutions to matters of public interest. This evening's discussion will be no different and is brought to you by the Alumni Relations Office and Brand SA. Tonight, our panel of experts will evaluate the state of the South African economy. They will also predict why a likely part formed part of the special adjustment budget that will be delivered by the Minister of Finance tomorrow. This discussion will be moderated by Dr. Morris Mtumbeni, who is our Executive Director for the faculty at the Gibbs Business School. We also would like to congratulate Dr. Mtumbeni for being appointed as Dean of the Business School. Allow me to introduce our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Tawana Kupe, to say a few words. Over to you, Prof. Kupe.
Our alumni and our associates and our friends, we thank you very much for joining us today. These are very important thought leadership series. Just want also to say a few words about UP. Gibbs turns 20 this year, is the leading business school on the continent, number 38 in the world in executive education. Our Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences turns 100 this year, a century of producing professionals from accounting to economists to people in human resources and all of those fields. Our Faculty of Veterinary Science, the only Faculty of Veterinary Science in South Africa, also celebrates a centenary. UP, as you know, powerful university, produces the most research in South Africa, one of the largest, 55,000 students, produces 28% of our engineers for our economy, and also for the infrastructural needs that it does, and also very powerful on the continent with our Future Africa Institutes, our new 4IR facility, Engineering 4.0, and we are launching Innovation Africa at UP for precision, sustainable agriculture that is future-oriented. Tonight, we discuss a very important topic on the eve of the adjustment budget. Can we reimagine our economy and create a new society out of the ashes of technological disruption, economic decline, as well as the massive impacts of COVID-19? I think this is going to be exciting. As you know, we continue with the same panel after the budget on the 25th. Let's enjoy this festival of ideas. Democracy, a sustainable economy, economic creativity, innovation, and imagination comes from these kinds of events. A very warm welcome. Thank you to our panelists, a star lineup, good intellects, insightful intellects, cutting-edge thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Kupe. Tonight's discussion is the first part of two discussions on special adjustment budget. The post-budget debate is scheduled for Thursday, 25 June at 6. Please make sure you join us for that discussion as our experts examine the key interventions announced by the Minister. We hope you enjoy tonight's discussion with us, and please don't forget to drop us your comments in the live feed. Thank you so much. Over to you, Morris.
Thank you very much, Sam. My name is Morris Mtombeni from the Gordon Institute of Business Science. I'm very proud to be here with you this evening and joined by an illustrious panel as we take this Lead Up Thought Leadership series to another level. So today we are considering the COVID-19 interventions, the economic stimulus plan, and we are interested to see the extent to which government will have considered a different approach to giving us an opportunity to survive and thrive through this difficult cycle that we find ourselves in solidarity with the rest of the world. At the end of this session, I hope that we will give you some perspectives that will help you to feel more confident that our government and business leaders and social partners have been able to consult and arrive at good ideas that help us to understand how we'll be able to fund their various initiatives. So revenue collection is very important. And also how we are going to source the necessary funding from institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and other development financing institutions. And also we'll have a much better sense of what the global economic outlook is likely to be and how this is going to impact on the South African local economic perspective. And also, we're really interested to know, is this time really different? Are things really going to change? So to help me to think through some of these questions and to help also moderate some of your questions, I will be joined by a few really esteemed speakers. But first, like any South African, let me begin with an apology. In the advert, we also indicated that we were going to be joined by the chairperson of the Industrial Development Corporation, Ms. Busisiwe Mabuza. Unfortunately, she was not able to join us, but I'm sure you will not be disappointed by her replacement. A very esteemed and knowledgeable economist has agreed to join us, and I'm sure he'll make this discussion worthwhile. But first, let me start with a highly respected economist who spends a lot of time both in the private sector and the public sector helping us to make sense of what is happening and what should be happening. Allow me to introduce Dr. Thabi Leoka as our first panelist. Hi, Thabi. You want to say a word or two greeting the participants on the call?
Thank you, Dr. Mtembeni, for the introduction, and I look forward to this discussion. It is very important, given this very critical period in our time, and very different. I mean, we've never experienced a pandemic in our lifetime, and also the consequences of the pandemic are dire, and they need everyone to roll up their sleeves and help the economy recover. And this, I mean everyone, I literally mean everyone, because everyone has been impacted and everyone can make a difference.
Lovely. Thank you. So when I used to work in Sandton, there used to be a place called Alexander Forbes. And in this place called Alexander Forbes, they used to have a big billboard and they said, this place is crawling with actuaries. And I could just imagine a whole host of actuaries crawling through their various buildings in Alexander Forbes. But now this particular call will be crawling with doctors. So allow me to please introduce our next panelist and co-host and funder of this particular session, the General Manager for Research at Brand SA, Dr. Petrus de Kock. Petrus, you want to say a few words just to say hi to everybody?
Evening, Morris, and thank you very much for hosting us for this discussion. I think, as we will discuss tonight, we are in completely extraordinary times, not just as a country, but as a humanity. So I think I want to go back to something the Vice Chancellor said. It's a time for imagination. So really, as we deal with the crises, we also need to think not just outside of boxes, but in completely new ways. So I look forward to our discussion tonight.
Lovely. And of course, we don't want to be overwhelmed by doctors, so maybe we should step it up a little bit and go slightly more than a doctor. You get a doctor, then you get more than a doctor in the academic field. So allow me to introduce you to the next panelist, who may be known to many of you, Dr. Professor, if you were in Germany, Adrian Seville. You're on mute, Dr. Professor. So you may want to unmute.
Let me start then with how every meeting in South Africa, in the world, begins now. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Clearly, my doctorate or professorship is not in tech.
But we look forward to your insights nonetheless, which are not required to be technological.
Great to be with you. Thank you for having me on the panel.
Finally, it's always useful to have the practical man on the ground who's neither a doctor nor professor, but he speaks truth to power, none other than the director for the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, Mr. Duma Kibule.
Hello, how are you?
Well, thanks, and you, Duma.
Yes.
Any words of welcome?
Okay, I'm really happy to be invited to this forum. It is the most important budget in our post-apartheid history, and like Dr. Petrus was saying, this is a time for imagination, and it's a time to transcend the old ways of the policies that we had that haven't worked for 26 years. And everywhere I go, people are asking, if these policies haven't worked for 26 years, why are we continuing with them?
Lovely. So we always need the agent provocateur, and so I'm very happy to have you online. So what we're also going to have, we're going to be running polls. So we're going to ask our participants, our delegates, to please, as you can see, the poll is being reflected on the screen there. You're required to please go into Slido, and on Slido, please use the event code, which is hashtag #LeadUp23June, i.e. lead UP 23 June, and you then will be able to get onto that poll, and the questions will be listed in terms of, the first one is given there, which topic would you most likely to learn about in the future, and then based on what you say, we'll bring the experts in the respective topic areas. First, now let me kick off with a general question around what we can expect from the finance minister, but maybe more to the point, what should we expect from the finance minister, and what is pragmatic about what he's likely to be telling us tomorrow in his emergency budget? I wonder if I could kick off possibly then with you, Tabi, and we'll work our way around the various panelists.
Thank you, Morris. So I think, look, a lot has changed since the February budget, and not just the world, South Africa, and also the numbers that National Treasury had. And if we look at what they should be doing and what they will do, is that they'll obviously look at adjusting their figures and changing policy. So in the past couple of years, I think since 2012, when we introduced the ceiling, this expenditure ceiling, our policy was to cut expenditure, even though we were not successful in cutting expenditure, because recently, in the recent years, we started expanding, even though we were supposed to cut expenditure. And, and that's obviously because of bad decisions on funding state-owned entities. And so now we find ourselves in a pandemic, and we have to spend, and we have to help the country from sinking, save the country from sinking. So what that means is that we're going to see an increase in expenditure, likely to be in education, in health, in sanitation, water, transportation. We're likely to see a deficit of around 14%. And I say this with confidence because these numbers were leaked, but if you looked at what commentators and economists were saying before, the numbers about right. We were around 14-15% in terms of a deficit. We expect, GDP to contract to between 8 to 10% this year, which also means that if you look at what we expect in terms of unemployment numbers, not the one that have just been released, but the second quarter is going to be the one that is more telling. We expect, obviously, that speaks to revenue collection, that it's going to be less. So if you combine this, fewer revenue collection, GDP growth is much weaker, a huge expansion, that means that we're going to sink deeper and deeper into debt. And we have to then pour in money to help us from sinking further. So that in the main, that's what we expect to see. But I expect, I wish if you had asked me what I would want them to do, that's a different question, but we'll get to that. I don't want to.
Maybe that's the question we should be asking Duma. Thank you so much, Tabi. So we're hearing Tabi's got her ear to the ground. She's got people leaking stuff to her, and hopefully she doesn't get arrested for getting leaks from all these important government officials. In the meantime, on your side, maybe you could tell us not what we think is going to be said, but rather what should be said. What policies should the Minister of Finance be focusing on? Because we still have 24 hours when we could influence his thinking, Duma.
The unemployment numbers came today. We've got 10.8 million unemployed people. The unemployment rate for Black African people is 44%. The unemployment rate for Black African females is 48%. The unemployment rate in the Eastern Cape, where half my family is 49%. With this, the worst contraction in a century, we're likely to see unemployment go beyond 50%. So the whole society in a very short time is going to become completely unviable. And we have to think boldly. I believe that we have to start thinking about a basic income grant. I'll put it at the upper bound poverty level. That is about 1,227 rands per person for 33 million people between the ages of 18 and 59. So that is the first thing that I would do if I'm in charge. And we have to look at the basic income grant. We should look at the fact that you must look at the net cost of such an expenditure, because it creates the income, some of the income to pay for itself. That's number one. So number two is that we're obviously, I don't even know where to start, because we have to see a coordinated response from the monetary and fiscal policy. We have to do things that we haven't done before. The response from the government has been wholly inadequate so far. My calculation in terms of the 500 billion stimulus, it is not a 500 billion rand stimulus. For example, we've already seen that the loan guarantee has not worked. That's 40% of the so-called 500 billion stimulus. So then we have to start cutting. Most of that was reprioritization of existing spending and tax deferrals, which also shouldn't account. So for the net treasury contribution, according to my calculation, is only 71 billion, or 1.4% of GDP. Now, on the monetary policy side, we saw a 275 basis points cut in interest rate. That is not enough. That wouldn't have been enough to address the crisis before the crisis, because the numbers that you saw today, they just reflect the crisis before the crisis. So I would want to see a bold our deficit will double to 750, the budget deficit, 750 billion rand at least. I would like to see the South African Reserve Bank step in to finance that and stand by to finance that together with the Public Investment Corporation. And I would also like to see both parties come together and work on a proper stimulus, not the one that we've seen, that is going to it's going to save us from sinking, as Tabi says, and it's also going to kickstart the recovery. So we need something far in excess of what has happened currently. And the last thing I want to say is that our debt to GDP ratio will increase to 80%. Now, every other country in the world will experience a 10 to 15 percentage point increase in the debt to GDP ratio. So in a relative terms, we're going to be at the same place we were before the crisis. So we shouldn't panic as South Africans. There is no tipping point at which a debt to GDP ratio results in a collapse of an economy. So we shouldn't be scared. We should confront this thing, I think, yeah.
Oh, siyabonga Mlungu. So, Adrian, there's some dizzying amount of numbers being thrown at us. A 14% what, and a 10% what, and a 80% what. All I hear is lots more spending and lots more social support, which is on the expenditure side. I still don't know where the money is going to come from and what is going to cost us to get this money. Have you any thoughts in this regard? Do you agree with the more moderate view that Tabi is presenting, or the more expansive view that Duma is advocating for? In either case, I'm still left wondering where the money is going to come from.
Morris, when we get into budget conversations, invariably what happens is we are surprised on the day. That what we imagine is going to materialize doesn't materialize. So I'm not going to try and be an expert in forecasting ahead of the event. We'll know this time tomorrow what the budget looks like. And as Tabi points out, there's already a fair chunk in the wires. And so that part of the guesswork has been taken out. Not to try and be too clever by half, but I think that there is a very obvious play on words here. That when we're talking about budgets and South African budgets recently, the reference immediately goes to the size of the deficit. And I think that South Africa's deficit issue is not one of numbers. It's one of confidence and delivery. That South Africa actually has enough money. And I love Duma's point about the basic income grant. There is so much evidence coming globally that points to the importance of the way in which this can reinforce, support social fabric. And South Africa's social fabric is dangerously strained. We can spend even more money on the same ways or old-fashioned or old habits. And to me, that would be a crisis squandered. Because we know what needs to be done here. And what needs to be done, I'm going to venture, sits in the 77-pager that Treasury released at the end of last year. And it talks about available and important adjustments that will help the economy find a far more substantial and stronger footing that translates into the critical term is inclusive growth. You can label it any way you like, but South Africa's deep entrenched ailments are inequality and unemployment. And unless we square up to that in this crisis, we will have squandered the crisis. So I want to hear three things. I want to hear a collective acknowledgement that we are in crisis. I want to hear a reference to the important structural adjustments that will happen to deal with unemployment and inequality, and that the emphasis will be delivery, not talk.
Lovely. Petrus, it sounds like we're getting some consensus around if we stay with the current stimulus budget of 500 billion, that is the minimum. And in fact, we need much more than that. We need much more aggressive structural changes. As somebody who is proudly South African, somebody who represents the country on multiple global platforms, how do you feel if we're to go down this route, that this message will be received by international funders, international lending partners like the IMF and the World Bank and others, in terms of a South Africa that is saying we want to be more expansive in our restructure and more expensive in our support structure in terms of the turnaround of our country and setting us up on a more sustainable basis?
No, Morris, thanks. I want to connect to a number of the comments made. I think something that we've been following very closely at Brand SA since last year already. I think you just, Adrian, referred to the Treasury discussion document that was released last year. The President once again reiterated it in State of the Nation address of this year. And I think this budget speech will be very interesting to watch in terms of that agenda, because there's definitely a lot of action. A few concrete examples I can show, like in the DTI, for example, there's been a team from the World Bank working with Invest SA for quite a while already on the investment infrastructure in the country. And that is part of the President's investment drive of gaining $100 billion of investment over 5 years. So there's been practical work done on a lot of systems, processes to enable the business environment. But I also want to couch some of my first comments. We released a document quite recently. I shared it with UP, and Morris, you're more than welcome as the university to share it with the alumni. It's called, it's a bit of an environment analysis document, and we work it under the title Collaboration as Mitigating Factor. And basically what we're doing in the document is to map out key current interventions that's coming March, April, May, and now moving towards the budget, but also very important looking at the global environment, because in as much as we're discussing monetary, fiscal, policy interventions inside South Africa, we must always remember we are in a totally unheard of period in world history where nearly 50% of the world population at some point in time in the last few months were under lockdown, no economic activity. I think whether you're looking at France, the UK, the US, or Belgium, or whichever country you're looking at, all central banks, all governments are battling with exactly the same question. How do we sustain our economies and how do we stimulate growth going forward? Now, two quick, just interesting comments I think we can maybe chew on later on. If we go beyond budget and the key interventions that's coming, we must also now ask ourselves, what are the core capabilities of the country that exists? For example, our special economic zones are very powerful and very attractive from an FDI point of view. Global supply chains have been affected badly. Now, South Africa, with a very strong manufacturing capability on the African continent, could, for example, in coming years, take up a lot of very interesting slack and reshore and create new manufacturing to feed into the African market. So I'm putting those out there as not immediate solutions. But that's where Prof. Kupe's comment on creativity and new innovation has to come in. You know, that I think as academics, as officials in government, in business, etc., we really need to ask ourselves now, where and how do we go hunting for those opportunities? Because state intervention, central bank intervention will take us a certain part of the way, but then the initiative has to be picked up through new forms of collaboration to find those new growth spaces. And I think we are very interested in that kind of conversation.
So let me stay with you for a second, Petrus, and maybe a quick, short and sharp response. Responding to a question being raised on the comment line here by Zahira. She's really interested in what is wrong with our implementation skills in this country. In that we seem to have difficulty in implementing the plans that we arrive at. So maybe if you could take us into your confidence and don't manage us too much. If we were to throw all the money that Adrian and Duma wants us to throw at the problem, how do we know that it will reach the right places? Because it seems like implementation is the problem that we have in this country.
You know what? I think we need to look at it on a very much a case-by-case basis. You know, like, for example, when we debate policy in South Africa, yes, there's a lot of instances where we can have a lot of criticism of certain policies, but then we also, I think, sometimes forget about the success story. Let me tell you just one, I think, key policy success in this country is something I referred to earlier, which is our special economic zones. If you go to the European Union Business Council in South Africa, they themselves would express a lot of confidence how attractive these things are. And that's a policy success. There's not just a policy, it's there. You can go touch it, you can feel it, you can see the businesses that settle there. So I think what we need to do is honest assessment. I think the president has said this in many occasions, that we need to understand, yes, there are failures, but I think also at the same time, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater on every occasion, because there are also cases where we have successes, you know. So anyway, I think there's a case-by-case debate to be had.
So you're going to stay in your lane and give us the good news story. We like that. And maybe I will ask that question again of somebody else. Tabi, on you, there's a question here from Tabi saying, I don't know if it's your namesake or your cousin sister by another name. And she wants to know, how do we balance our books eventually when our debt balloons to the kinds of numbers that Duma has raised, like 80% debt to GDP? How do we make sense of that?
You know, that's my main worry with this period, because even before the pandemic, our debt was very high. Even before the pandemic, we were struggling to rein in our debt. I think the issue of implementation is very, very important, because we are currently incurring debt because of failure to implement in previous years. So there was a tweet that the Minister of Water and Sanitation released, and she was basically, she tweeted a message that she received from someone who had thanked her for bringing water to the village after 15 years. And I was just mortified by her glee at this message, because she was also the Minister of Housing. So she occupied her position 10 years ago. So this was her responsibility 10 years ago too, and her administration's responsibility. So I think I worry that we are incurring debt where actually the debt was, the financing was allocated a long time ago to do the very thing that we're doing now because of the pandemic. And what it's resulting in is that it's increasing the debt. And what I sympathize with what Duma is saying in that we need to, that the funding is not enough. The funding is not enough because we didn't do what we should have done a long time ago. And now we're trying to fast track everything now because we're in a crisis. But the problem is with that is that the people who are implementing these policies or are spending now are not going to be around to pay the debt in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. The burden is now going to be on the youth of South Africa to continue paying the debt that was incurred today. So, Ntabi Singh's question is very difficult because I don't know how to answer it. We have to, austerity is not what we should be doing now, because what we should be doing, you can't cut spending during a crisis like this, because you need to actually put money in the problem so that you can support the economy. But ultimately, there has to be a plan beyond this on how you're going to rein in the spending and how you're going to rein in the losses. And, I think what we need to do is also look at where the leakages are. I think that Adrian was correct in saying that we have a lot of money in the country. It's just not going to the right places. Our budget is going to the wrong places. Rather than capital investment, which is infrastructure investment, it's going towards consumption, and it has been for the past couple of years. So I think we need to hold the current leadership, and say, well, we need to ensure that they don't waste this money. And I know that they're getting money from all sorts of places, various multilateral organizations, but we need to hold them to account and ensure that after this period, they need to find a way that will start reining in the money and make sure that the leakages and the corruption stops.
Lovely. Duma, I'm going to come to you next when we do our second round of questions. But it's time now for me to read out the results of the first poll. It seems like, particularly for the economists amongst us, there are about 44% of the participants would like to know more about macroeconomic policy and related effects. And micro people like myself were not as popular. So there's about 15% of the participants that are interested in what's happening in the microeconomic space. I'm going to punt microeconomics for those that are interested. That's what you and I in our small businesses are involved with in our homes. We are microeconomists, as in what is our role in the solutioning of this problem, whereas the people like Petrus and Duma are macroeconomists because they're interested in preaching from the top. So just remember that next time when you vote. And of course, others 11% want tax legislation. I would have thought this would have been higher because we want to slash taxes, but nonetheless, it seems like people are happy to pay high taxes. And about 11 wants to know more about financial markets, and the balance are undecided. So this is what people want to learn more about. And so I'm sure Sam and her team in the alumni office will pick up on this and give you more feedback. Duma, I want to now kick off the question picking up on, so the question is, my apologies. The question that you're going to be answering on Slido is, would you like to learn more about government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic? It's a yes or no, brothers and sisters. So go for it, enjoy it, and allow me to ask Duma a specific question. So Duma, you clearly have very specific views. I'm interested to know whether your policy aspirations are more on the consumption side of the equation or more on the development and economic development side of the equation. And to the regard, however you answer the question, how do you think government or the Minister of Finance is going to land on your wish list?
I think it's a false dichotomy between. Let me just start. Under normal circumstances, a stimulus should be on infrastructure because it's got higher multiplier impacts in terms of growth and employment. And that's what we should do under normal circumstances. But under this circumstance, what it has done is to fast forward on all our pre-existing problems. Unemployment, fast forward. Inequality, fast forward. You see the problems of the two education systems, where some kids, like my kid here in the house, he's studying, he's not affected by the shutdown of the university. But the poor people, they're affected by it, you know. And fast forward on every single problem that we have in our poverty, fast forward. So what is happening now, Dr. Mtombeni, is that our society is becoming unviable. And we need to now have a humanitarian, if you have an earthquake, the first thing you do is a humanitarian response. You have to make sure that the people are fed. Our government has done a shocking job in terms of providing food aid. And for me, that is the most disappointing part of this response, is the inability to feed the people during this humanitarian crisis, this earthquake. And you might have seen the figures from HSRC, the amount of people who went without food, 55%, I think, in the townships and informal settlements. The second thing is that you have to provide people income, disaster relief. And this is the humanitarian response. Now, that's not what you would do under normal circumstances. Now, while I'm talking about the basic income grant, we really have to look at the economic development. It's not a consumption or if there is a basic income, people are going to spend it. People are going to, the informal people in the businesses that are going to invest in their informal businesses. And in the townships, there'll be more money circulating in the townships for people to spend, and the businesses in the townships are going to become more viable. That is what I'm trying to say. So you mustn't just see it as wasted spending, but because of the nature of the situation, the multiplier might be less than what we'll get from infrastructure. But because we need to keep our society intact, we have no option but to go this route at this moment. And then lastly, let me just quickly talk about the funding of this thing. We have to be very creative. First of all, the central bank can do monetary financing of some of these elements of this, number one. Number two, I believe that we should have a once-off restructuring of our national balance sheet. Our balance sheet has got about 1.9 trillion in the PIC. This is after the collapse of the share prices, my calculation, end of March. They've also got about 240 billion in cash resources. We've got foreign exchange reserves of 922 billion rands. And this is the asset side of the balance sheet, okay? So now the point is, I believe that we should have a once-off restructuring of this balance sheet. Let's do a scenario where 50% of the PIC, we cut the level of funding to 50%. That would release a lot of money, about 850 billion rand. To restructure this balance sheet, we could reduce our debt to GDP ratio by 500 billion, because the PIC could write off the debt that the government owes to it. And then number two, it could write off the debt of the state-owned entity of Eskom. And so those are the type of things. Now, after you've got PIC is operating on 50% of its income, of its assets, I work out that it will still have a surplus of about 15 billion rands a year in terms of income minus expenditure. So those are the type of things that we have to do. And number three, I believe we have to have an accord with, the ANC, they call it prescribed assets, but we've got very deep financial markets. And I believe that we have to have a voluntary accord with the financial sector. 9.3 trillion rands in non-bank financial assets, according to the latest bulletin. And a portion of it, I don't think anyone in their right mind would not agree that a portion of that must go towards developmental or impact investments. But I agree with everybody who says we can't bail out SAA with that or Eskom with that. And the reason for that is that we can't pay for investment that happened in the past that was wasted. We should pay for investment that's going to happen tomorrow, that's going to create jobs tomorrow. So those are the three ways I would think about. And yeah. Sorry.
Thank you, Adrian. So Duma is Duma, do you want to just mute for a second there, please? Duma is coming into your capital market space, making some strong claims, some interesting ideas about how the first response should be a humanitarian one, a social response, but the second, a more sustainable response is a balance sheet restructure and a co-option of the capital markets to participate in the restructure of the South African economy. Do you want to build on that? Is this an idea that has legs, or is this a researcher gone mad?
He's still online. Hey?
We've muted him, so he's fine. He can hear us. We can't hear him when he swears at us.
Morris, the idea of restructuring the balance sheet, I think, is a very powerful one. What I am frustrated about is that this idea could have been implemented at a time when we were much stronger. That the balance sheet that you've got now is substantially weaker than the balance sheet of 10 years ago. And in fact, 10 years ago, I met the Minister of Finance and made a similar but different proposal to what Duma's referring to. And it was about ways in which the state balance sheet could participate in one of the largest empowerment transactions in the country. And there is a substantial asset that is available to, let's use the term, achieve radical economic transformation, because nothing short of that will solve South Africa's problems. South Africa needs a radical restructure. Our industrial architecture remains 1980s. Our economic geography still looks like the 1980s. When Duma's making a point about basic income grant, the risk that the basic income grant runs is that you allocate this critical spending to people who are at the poverty line, and then all of the income just seeps back to the large concentrated formal sector. And a large chunk of that will leak into import markets. So you're not going to achieve the real inclusive and restructuring that you need to bring about. So I think that state balance sheet is just one aspect. There are many other ways in which we could do this. Having said all of that, reallocating money to me is an act of folly unless we really acknowledge the issues that sit resident with delivery. And unless we get that delivery and accountability resolved, we will be back here in 2, 3, 5 years' time with an even bigger financial hole. And the problem with that type of crisis when you become Venezuelan is it happens very, very slowly and then all of a sudden. Our chances now.
Adrian, thank you for that, but I am going to push you, and I think you've partially kind of played your hand regarding the role of the capital markets, the so-called prescribed assets that weren't introduced by the ANC, by the way, Duma.
Sure.
They were introduced by the National Party before them. Am I allowed to say National Party on this platform? Oh, I've said it, National Party.
Okay. Well, I think a very good job of avoiding your question there.
I was listening, Adrian. So will you be advising your clients to look forward to reallocating portions of their assets in the common good of the country if Minister Kubule was to pass a law tomorrow to suggest an increase in prescribed assets or an introduction in prescribed assets?
I'm mindful of our constraints of time, so let me be quick. I think that there's two questions in your question. The first one is, would I allocate assets to the existing budget? No, Tabi's already made the point. It is overwhelmingly consumption laden, and it's not sustainable, and it isn't translating into growth. So the existing budget structure is a bad investment. Look at the return on state-owned enterprises. They are sub cost of capital. So if you just say, give us money to keep funding what we're doing, I think that that's a really bad investment idea. if there is a different proposal and it's give us money to fund investments that have impact, very often the response to impact is, oh, well, this is like vegetable gardening. You know, I must compromise my investment return to do some good. The gorgeous thing about impact investment is you don't have to compromise return. You can have this delicious thing that economists call win-win outcomes. So if you can show me a serious impact avenue where that capital will be allocated to viable assets that will have this impact and inclusion, I'm in. Show me where I sign.
Lovely.
Can I
Petrus,
jump in here?
you can jump anytime.
So I don't agree with using the bank's balance sheet or the government's balance sheet. I come back to the point that we can actually pay back our debt if we're committed to doing so, and I would like us to do so rather than throw Reserve Bank money or PIC funds, which are essentially government employees' funds, into old investments. I just think that there are consequences to using a balance sheet, a government balance sheet. The other thing is that there are mandates too. So the PIC or GPF cannot is not mandated to do that. The other thing with the prescribed assets, same thing. I don't think that asset managers currently are interested in throwing money at an SAA if they don't believe that we should have a national carrier, or they're interested in Eskom if they don't believe that Eskom is sustainable. And unfortunately, recent history has taught us that these entities have been badly managed, and if you make an investment in them, the chances of your investment having returns are very little. If anything, these are distressed assets. So I do think that we need to stop finding other avenues where the elephant is in the room and is looking at us. We need to cut a lot of the unnecessary expenditure, even if it includes wages, which is something that I propose that I don't think it's politically sound or politically palatable, or even the unions would agree to it. But everyone is, in the private sector is cutting wages and not the government. I would also propose that I totally agree with Professor Saville's suggestion of impact investment. Today we had a full day's symposium on investment that was led by Minister Patricia de Lille. The president spoke, and the Dr. Ramokgopa was part of it because he heads up the infrastructure within the presidency. And there were great ideas that came from the private sector that don't touch government budget, the fiscus at all, where the private sector is willing to step in and invest in infrastructure. And I think that's where we should go. Impact investing, sustainable growth, where we know that we are, that whoever's interested in throwing their money at this is willing to take the risk, but also the responsibility. There is a balance in terms of who, in terms of responsibility, because both the private sector and the public sector are involved in it. So that's where I'd like to see it. That's something new and fresh, where there's, PPP, private-public partnerships, there's accountability. It's not utilizing the fiscus.
Lovely. Thank you, Tabi. So let me just tell you, because we are quickly rushing to the end, I want to lean into some of the questions that we're getting on the chat line. Before I do so, I want to go to Petrus and see, do you want to add anything to the comment on the infrastructure discussions that took place today? Yes, and then come to you, Adrian. I'll come to you just now, Petrus, and then come to you, Adrian, to please make a comment, maybe both Adrian and Duma, a comment on the role of the SARB. Let's first start with you, Petrus.
Yes, I'm happy Tabi raised the thing. There was actually the symposium happened today, chaired by the president. And I think we can anticipate some interesting announcements from that of very new, not just thinking in terms of projects, but also new investment coming online that will bring jobs. I think that's one space to watch. Something else that's important as we grapple with the immediate impact, on the 20th of June, on Friday, the BRICS, the new development bank, announced they awarding a loan to the value of $1 billion to South Africa from an emergency facility. And that emergency facility will directly assist the country in the fight against COVID and also for our social program. So I think that also deals a bit with the debate that's been in the air. Are we going to get World Bank, IMF support, whatever? So the BRICS Development Bank has stepped into the breach, and we will get significant support from there. But I also think in terms of the bigger...
Before we move on, Petrus, Marcus is really interested on that last point that you're making about, are you concerned about the terms of this BRICS Bank loan that you're talking about?
Actually, you know what, if you look at the operation of the BRICS Development Bank, they work on a very different philosophy to your typical multilateral lenders, you know, like an IMF or a World Bank. And I'm sure the BRICS Development Bank officials in the country office here are more than happy to engage on the details of where they have very different lenses through which they award the identify and award the project. So we are dealing with, I think, with a very different lending institution that looks very differently at the member countries than your typical multilateral lender.
So you're not too concerned. You're more comfortable with that money than another multilateral institution. Coming to you now, Adrian, can you tell us some comments about how do you feel about the role of the Reserve Bank so far? Do you think they could play a broader role? We know that Duma is underwhelmed. What's your view?
I think that we need to be very, very careful on this Reserve Bank surface, that one of the attributes of South Africa that stands out in global markets is the independence, the strength of our Reserve Bank. When we start walking into the water of using Reserve Bank assets, these are assets that have a very, very different purpose and an entirely different impact. They are designed to preserve the purchasing power of the currency, the stability of capital markets. If you start shepherding them into shoring up a government balance sheet that has been misallocated, I think that that's very, very dangerous water. And there are not many countries that have gone down that slope and come back and find form. The most recent disastrous example is Venezuela. So I would just be very, very careful of reaching for Reserve Bank assets. In fact, I wouldn't be careful. I don't think it's a negotiable. Before I step away, just one quick comment. Ideologically, we get very caught up in ownership, that either it's state-owned or private-owned. I want us to drop this from the conversation and stop obsessing about ownership and just ask about performance. I can give you lots of private sector companies that are abysmally run, and the capital should be pulled away from them. So let's stop about ownership and let's worry about performance. The difference with a public sector entity is its public domain and its collective impact. And we can find lots of fantastic global examples. Development Bank of Singapore, SingPost, are wonderful examples that we could take as models to help shape our impact, performance, and delivery of public enterprise.
Lovely. Before I go to the questions, quick, short, and sharp, please, Duma. Are you still continuing to be demanding more action from the Reserve Bank, or are you partially persuaded by Adrian to rein yourself in a little bit? You're on mute.
When I talked about this this investment accord, I said so upfront that none of it should go towards SAA and Eskom. It should create impact investments that will create jobs tomorrow. So what I also forgot to say, it doesn't have to go through government. I think we'd love to see public-private agencies, temporary ones, that will be involved in delivering these assets for our country. After the New Deal in the US, there was a lot of public-private agencies that were set up temporarily to spend the money. We saw it in the World Cup as well. So I don't think all the money has to happen in government. So what I see, we could have a public agency to allocate resources. What should happen is that the city of Joburg, under Mashaba, they used to say they've got 170 billion rand backlog. So we would go and bid for a project. I want to create jobs in El Dorado Park. there will be a set of criteria by which we award these jobs that are going to be created. So it could be the city of Joburg, it could be a private company, it could be a government department that could go and bid. I mean, they could go and show them what they can do to create jobs, and it would be evaluated by a public-private agency according to certain criteria. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of what I'm proposing, in the past, I would have supported a job guarantee like many people in the US. But because of the lack of capacity in our government that couldn't even deliver the distress grant, that couldn't deliver PPPs, that couldn't deliver food, I think we have to have a basic income grant that goes direct to the people. But under normal circumstances, I would probably have done a job guarantee. But a job guarantee requires it must be implemented at the local government level, and we don't have the local government infrastructure and capacity to implement it at that level. So that is what I'm talking about today.
Lovely. Thank you so much. So I think you've, in part of your answers, Duma, you've also answered a question from Shamiso on the role of public and private partnerships beyond the pandemic. You've given some insight into that. I'm going to ask you one last question to pull it together. But before I do, I'd like to give you guys some feedback. And that is, we've actually done quite well in this talk because 81% of the voting public want to hear more about this stuff. So you may well be called upon in the future to talk more about how can we restructure our economy, can we restructure our industries, can we restructure society to survive beyond the pandemic and then thrive once the pandemic is over. So that is the result of the second poll. Suppose we've got 4 minutes left, really short, sharp, and sweet. I'm going to cut in. I would really like you to reflect on a question from one of the participants that really touches on one of the things that the president is obsessed with. And the question really has to do with this thing called technology. And the question is from Sam and says, will massive investment in technology infrastructure and digital skills truly be a catalyst for economic growth, especially considering remote working and e-learning as examples of restructuring that have taken place? So I'm going to work my way backward and end with you, Tabi, because I started with you in the beginning. I'll start with you, Duma, go to you, Adrian, go to you, Petrus, and complete with you. So these are your last times that we're having a conversation.
So back in the day, the technology question is fascinating. I used to advise Telkom like a few years ago. And I used to ask them, why is it so difficult to set up broadband in every single school in South Africa? And they would come with all sorts of explanations. And what I noticed is that they went to the community where the CEO was, and they set up broadband in Grassy Park in Cape Town. But I couldn't understand why they couldn't roll it out in the rest of the country. So I agree with Sam 100%. We need to roll out this broadband fiber in all the schools. There must be a minimum set of assets in every school, include security to broadband infrastructure, so that we have to have unified these two education systems, and we cannot continue to have this inequality in our two education systems. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Quickly, 30 seconds, Adrian.
The answer is already in the 77 pager. It's one of the network industries. And South Africa's network is expensive and choked. So just opening up that data freeway would be a first step. And then there are all types of avenues and channels that business could get in a range of different sizes and forms. It's Lovely. Not a silver bullet, but big part of the solution.
Thank you, Petrus. Short, sharp, and sweet.
Two things. I think looking forward to the budget tomorrow. I'm still repeating what I said earlier. I think we need to watch the policy, the broader reform agenda space. I think that's very important. On the question, the tech impact is a big debate in the country, but let me round up this way. If we look at particular sectors in this country, we're dealing with a historical project of land reform that we have to engage with. We're dealing with issues around agricultural development and food security. Now, if you look for IR, technology in agriculture can actually be a catalyst for tremendous employment creation. So it very much depends on what sector you're looking at. Tech doesn't always translate into job. So
cool.
Just a final thought. Thank you.
All right. Finally, before I hand over to you, Tabi, because you're going to close us out, there's a final poll that we're going to run, and I'm going to ask everybody to please run it. Is how likely are you to refer to this lead-up event to business colleagues and other alumni, with 1 being very unlikely and 10 being extremely lucky? Extremely likely. Please know, I know where you live, so please press 10, and I look forward to seeing you again on Thursday. Finally, Tabi, final few comments, very briefly. Sorry, 10 seconds.
Yeah, so the gig economy is the economy of the future. Unfortunately, a few years ago, South Africa had a policy that would connect health, government, and schools. So all of them would have free connectivity to the internet by 2030. We're now in 2020, and we still don't have connectivity throughout the country. Now imagine, I actually think that the deadline was much closer than 2030. Now imagine if we had successfully done at least 90% of that in 2020, and this pandemic hit us, in 2020, how far that would have taken us in terms of e-learning and e-healthcare, etc. So again, going back to my earlier point, failure of policy in the past has caught up on us.
Thank you so much, Tabi. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everybody that has been viewing this and everybody that has been posing questions and participating in the polls. I'd like to thank Duma for your provocative comments, Adrian for holding the line for the capital markets, but being inclusive at the same time, a bit confusing, and Petrus for not wanting to speak ill of your bosses. Thank you, that was really entertaining. And finally, to you, Tabi, thank you for being pragmatic and reminding us that there are smart people out there. Thank you very much, everyone. See you again on Thursday. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.